The chapel bells of Meadowbrook rang softly through the crisp October air, their melody carrying across the valley like a whispered promise. Nora Bennett stood at the stone entrance, her fingers clutching the ivory invitation that had arrived 3 weeks earlier. The thick cardstock felt heavy in her hands, weighted with memories she had tried to leave behind. She had debated not coming. For days, the invitation had sat on her kitchen counter, unopened, while she convinced herself that returning to Meadowbrook would only reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. But something deeper than logic had compelled her to pack a bag, drive the 6 hours from the city, and now stand at the threshold of a church where her past and present collided. The chapel was modest, but beautiful, with tall windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. Wooden pews lined the center aisle, already filled with familiar faces from the town where she had grown up. Nora recognized the baker who used to slip her extra cookies, the librarian who had recommended her first art book, the mayor who still wore the same bowler hat to every formal occasion. She slipped into the very last pew, tucking herself against the carved wooden pillar that supported the choir loft above. From here, she could observe without being observed, watch without being watched. It was where she had always felt safest, on the edges of things, neither fully present nor completely absent. The organ began its processional melody, and the congregation rose as one. Nora stood slowly, her eyes fixed on the altar where Ryan Mitchell waited. He looked different than she remembered, more polished. Somehow, his shoulders squared with the confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. She felt nothing but a dull ache, like pressing on a bruise that had already faded to yellow. Sophie Grace appeared at the chapel entrance, radiant in a simple satin gown that caught the light with every step. She was lovely in an uncomplicated way, her smile genuine and warm. Nora found herself glad for Ryan, genuinely hoping he had found with Sophie what they had been unable to create together. As the bride passed her pew, Nora felt eyes upon her. She glanced to her left and found herself meeting the gaze of a man standing among the Groom'S family. He was tall and solidly built, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of weathered oak. Unlike the other guests who were focused on the bride, he was looking directly at her. There was no judgment in his expression, only a quiet curiosity and something else she could not quite name. Recognition, perhaps, though they had never met. Or understanding, as if he too knew what it felt like to sit in the back row of your own life. The moment lasted only seconds before he turned his attention back to the ceremony. But Nora found her heart beating faster, her skin warm, despite the cool autumn air drifting through the chapel's half-open windows. The ceremony unfolded with predictable beauty. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed, and when the officiant pronounced Ryan and Sophie husband and wife, the congregation erupted in applause. Nora clapped politely, her smile small but sincere. She had loved Ryan once, in the desperate way of people who mistake intensity for compatibility. She was glad he had found something calmer, something that would last. As guests filed out toward the reception hall, Nora waited in her pew, letting the crowd thin before making her way outside. The reception was being held in the meadow behind the chapel, where long tables draped in linen stood beneath strings of Edison bulbs that would glow like fireflies once evening fell. She accepted a glass of sparkling cider from a passing server, and drifted toward the edge of the gathering, where a row of old elm trees provided shade and distance from the celebration. The music started, a local band playing folk songs that everyone seemed to know by heart. Nora watched couples spin across the grass, children weaving between their legs, and elderly guests tapping their feet from chairs arranged in a loose semicircle. It was the kind of scene that belonged on a postcard, perfect in its simplicity. She was about to slip away unnoticed, when a voice spoke from behind her. The man from the chapel stood a respectful distance away, 2 glasses of lemonade in his hands. He offered one to her with a slight nod. His movements were unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world and no particular agenda beyond this moment. Nora accepted the glass, surprised by the gesture. He did not smile broadly or launch into small talk. Instead, he simply stood beside her, looking out at the celebration with the same quiet observation she had been practicing all afternoon. After a long moment, He spoke again, his voice low and textured like worn leather. He introduced himself as Owen Mitchell, the groom's older brother. He mentioned that he had noticed her sitting alone during the ceremony and wondered if she might appreciate some company. Now, though he would understand if she preferred solitude, there was no pressure in his words, no expectation. Just an honest offer from someone who seemed to understand the difference between loneliness and the need to be alone. Nora found herself saying yes. They stood together beneath the elm trees as the afternoon light shifted from gold to amber, talking in the way of people who recognize something kindred in each other. Owen told her about his carpentry business, about the satisfaction of working with wood and creating things meant to last. She told him about her art, about returning to Meadowbrook after years away, about trying to figure out what came next. Neither mentioned the wedding or the obvious connection between Nora and the groom. Those facts hung in the air between them, acknowledged, but not examined. Like old photographs kept in a drawer. When the band shifted to a slower song, and couples moved closer together on the makeshift dance floor, Owen asked if she would like to walk. Not dance, just walk. Away from the crowd, toward the creek that ran along the property's edge. Nora surprised herself by agreeing. They followed a narrow path through tall grass, still damp from morning dew, their footsteps quiet against the earth. The music faded behind them, till it was just another layer of sound, blending with birdsong and the whisper of wind through leaves. At the creek's edge, Owen picked up a smooth stone and sent it skipping across the water surface. 5 perfect bounces before it sank. He did not make it into a competition or a lesson. He simply did it, then stepped back to give Nora space if she wanted to try. She did. Her stone managed 3 skips. They stood in comfortable silence as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of rose and violet. Nora realized she had not checked her phone once since arriving at the wedding. She had not worried about what people thought of her being there, or rehearsed explanations for why she had come. For the first time in months, she had simply existed in a moment without trying to control or understand it. Owen seemed to sense when she was ready to return to the reception. They walked back together, the conversation easy and unhurried. He did not ask for her number or suggest meeting again. He simply thanked her for the walk and for the conversation, as if she had given him a gift rather than the other way around. As Nora drove home that evening, the wedding invitation tucked into her purse, she found herself thinking not about Ryan or the past, but about Owen's steady presence and the way he had offered companionship without demanding anything in return. She did not know if she would see him again. Meadowbrook was small, but she had no plans to stay long. Yet something had shifted during those quiet hours beneath the elm trees and beside the creek. Some small door had opened, just a crack, letting in the possibility that healing might look different than she had imagined. The road ahead was dark, lit only by her headlights and the distant glow of towns she passed. But for once, the darkness did not feel like an ending. It felt like the space between chapters, full of potential and quietly waiting to be filled. 3 weeks passed before Nora saw Owen Mitchell again. She had extended her stay in Meadowbrook, renting a small cottage on the edge of town that overlooked the valley. The landlord, an elderly woman named Beatrice, asked few questions and charged reasonable rent, seeming pleased to have the company, even if they only exchanged pleasantries when paths crossed. Nora had established a routine of sorts. Mornings were spent at the cottage painting watercolors of the changing landscape. Afternoons found her volunteering at the community center, helping organize an arts program for local children. Evenings, she walked through town, reacquainting herself with streets that had once been as familiar as her own heartbeat. It was during one of these evening walks that she discovered Owen's workshop. The building sat at the end of Maple Street, a converted barn with wide doors propped open to let in the cooling air. The sign above the entrance read Mitchell Carpentry in simple carved letters, and through the opening she could see workbenches covered with tools, half-finished furniture, and curls of wood shavings scattered across the floor like autumn leaves. She paused on the sidewalk, debating whether to continue past or acknowledge the connection. Before she could decide, Owen appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth stained with wood, oil, and varnish. He recognized her immediately, his expression shifting from neutral concentration to something warmer, though still reserved. He asked if she was settling into Meadowbrook comfortably, his tone suggesting genuine interest rather than polite conversation. Nora found herself accepting his invitation to see the workshop. She stepped inside, immediately enveloped by the rich scent of cedar and oak. The space was organized but lived in, every surface bearing the marks of constant use and careful attention. Owen showed her his current project, a dining table commissioned by a family celebrating their 50th anniversary. The wood was cherry, already glowing with the warmth that proper finishing would enhance. He ran his hand along the grain as he spoke about the couple, about building something meant to hold generations of meals and conversations and quiet mornings reading the newspaper. There was reverence in the way he talked about his work, understanding that what he created carried weight beyond function. Nora recognized the same feeling she experienced with her art, that sense of channeling something larger than yourself into physical form. She asked about the wood, about how he chose materials and knew which pieces belonged together. Owen explained that it was partly experience and partly intuition, reading the grain and understanding how different types would respond to shaping and stress. Some woods were forgiving, willing to bend. Others required more careful handling, respect for their natural resistance. The conversation drifted from carpentry to other topics as evening settled over the workshop. Owen lit several oil lanterns hanging from the rafters, their glow casting dancing shadows across the walls. He offered her coffee from a thermos he kept on his desk, apologizing for its strength and the lack of cream or sugar. Nora accepted, finding the bitter warmth comforting. They sat on stools near the open door, watching as streetlights flickered on along Maple Street and residents returned home from work or errands. Owen asked about her art, and Nora found herself describing her recent paintings with more enthusiasm than she had felt in months. She talked about trying to capture the quality of light at different times of day, about how returning to Meadowbrook had reminded her why she started painting in the first place. In turn, Owen shared pieces of his own story. He had left Meadowbrook after college, working construction in various cities for nearly a decade. He had married a woman named Caroline, an architect with ambitions that took them from project to project, never settling anywhere long enough to call it home. His voice grew quieter when he mentioned that Caroline had died 3 years ago in a car accident. They had been driving back from a site visit when another vehicle crossed the center line. She was killed instantly. Owen survived with a broken collarbone and ribs that still ached when the weather changed. After her death, he had returned to Meadowbrook, to the town and the trade he had learned from his grandfather. Carpentry had saved him, giving him something to do with his hands when his mind would not quiet, providing structure when everything else felt formless. Nora listened without interrupting, recognizing the particular quality of grief that had been carried long enough to soften but never fully disappear. She shared her own losses, not of death, but of dreams that had failed to materialize, of a relationship with Ryan that had been built on expectations rather than genuine understanding. She told Owen about the months after their breakup, about moving to the city and throwing herself into her art, only to find that success without connection felt hollow, about gradually realizing that she had been running from Meadowbrook, not because the town had hurt her, but because she had never learned how to be still enough to hear what she actually wanted. The conversation stretched into hours. Around them, Meadowbrook settled into its nighttime rhythms. Lights in distant houses winked out as families went to bed. The temperature dropped enough that Nora pulled her jacket tighter. Though she made no move to leave, Owen stood eventually, retrieving a thick wool blanket from a storage chest and draping it over her shoulders without ceremony. The gesture was practical rather than romantic, but Nora felt its kindness settle around her like the blanket itself. She asked if he ever felt lonely, living in the town where he grew up, surrounded by people who remembered him as he had been rather than who he was becoming. Owen considered the question carefully before answering. He said that loneliness had taught him the difference between being alone and being lonely, that he had felt more isolated in crowded cities with Caroline, both of them too busy to truly see each other, than he ever did now in his quiet workshop or his small house by the creek. he explained that coming back to Meadowbrook had not been about retreating or giving up. It had been about remembering what mattered, about building a life on foundation solid enough to support weight without crumbling. Nora understood. She told him about the relief she felt being back, despite her initial resistance, about how the city had made her feel like she was constantly performing, trying to become someone impressive rather than simply being herself. Owen smiled, the expression transforming his face from handsome to genuinely beautiful. He said that she seemed plenty impressive already, that anyone who could capture light the way she did clearly understood something essential about the world. The compliment was simple and sincere, free from flattery or agenda. Nora felt warmth spread through her chest, different from the coffee or the blanket, something internal and steady. They talked until midnight, when Owen finally insisted on walking her back to her cottage. The streets were empty, lit only by moon and occasional porch lights left on to guide late returners home. Their footsteps echoed softly against pavement, accompanied by the distant sound of the creek that ran through the valley. At her door, Owen paused. He did not try to kiss her or suggest future plans. He simply thanked her for the evening, for the conversation and the company. He said that he hoped she would stop by the workshop again if she wanted, but understood if she preferred to keep her evenings to herself. Nora surprised herself by saying she would like to come back, maybe in a few days, when he had made more progress on the anniversary table. She wanted to see how the wood transformed under his hands, how intention and skill combined to create something lasting. Owen nodded, his smile visible even in the dim light. He wished her good night and turned to walk back toward Maple Street, his figure growing smaller and darker until he disappeared around the corner. Inside the cottage, Nora did not immediately prepare for bed. Instead, she sat by the window overlooking the valley, watching clouds drift across the moon, and thinking about conversations that felt like coming home, about the difference between loneliness and solitude, about two people who had experienced loss learning to recognize possibility when it appeared quietly, without fanfare or certainty. She picked up her sketchbook and began drawing from memory, not the landscape or the cottage, but Owen's hands as they moved across the cherry wood, reading grain and understanding what the material needed to become what it was meant to be. The sketch was rough, more feeling than accuracy, but as her pencil moved across paper, Nora realized she was drawing more than hands. She was capturing patience, care, and the quiet confidence of someone who trusted the process, even when the outcome remained unclear. Outside, Meadowbrook slept peacefully beneath autumn stars. Inside the cottage, Nora worked until her eyes grew heavy, finally setting aside her sketchbook and climbing into bed with a lightness she had not felt in years. Tomorrow she would paint. The day after, she would return to the workshop. Beyond that, she did not know, and for once, the uncertainty felt like freedom rather than fear. The weeks that followed established a rhythm neither Nora nor Owen had consciously planned, but both welcomed. She would finish her volunteer work at the community center, then make her way to Mitchell Carpentry as evening approached. Owen would be there, hands busy with whatever commission occupied his attention, but always willing to pause and share his progress. Nora brought her sketchbook and watercolors, setting up in the corner of the workshop where natural light from the high windows lasted longest. She painted Owen's projects in various stages of completion, fascinated by the transformation of raw lumber into functional art. They talked while they worked, conversations flowing easily between comfortable silences. Owen told stories about his grandfather, who had taught him the trade, about learning that every mistake could teach something if you paid attention. Nora shared memories of her father, a high school art teacher who had died when she was 19, before she had learned to appreciate his gentle encouragement. One evening, Owen invited her to his house for dinner. The structure sat beside the creek, a small cottage he had renovated himself, with exposed beams and wide windows that framed views of the water. The interior was spare but warm, every piece of furniture built by his hands, every detail considered. He cooked simply but well, roasting vegetables from the farmer's market and preparing trout he had caught that morning. They ate at a table he had made during the first month after Caroline's death, working through grief one careful joint at a time. Nora asked about his marriage, about what he had learned from loving someone and losing them. Owen was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said that he and Caroline had loved each other genuinely, but had never truly understood one another. They had built a partnership on shared ambitions rather than complementary natures, pushing forward without ever stopping to ask if they were building towards something that would actually make them happy. After her death, Owen had spent months consumed by guilt, wondering if he had somehow failed her. Eventually, he realized that their relationship had been defined by movement, by chasing the next opportunity without ever creating space to simply exist together. They had mistaken momentum for meaning. Nora listened, recognizing parallels in her own experience with Ryan. They too had been focused on external markers of success, on becoming the couple they thought they should be, rather than discovering who they actually were together. She told Owen about the relief she had felt when Ryan finally ended things, about the guilt that followed that relief, about spending years trying to become someone worthy of love, without realizing she had been pursuing the wrong version of worthiness all along. Owen reached across the table and took her hand, his palm rough with calluses, but his touch gentle. He said that perhaps both of them had needed to learn the difference between building a life and building a life together, between partnership born from fear of being alone and connection lived in genuine recognition. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they cleared dishes and moved to the porch overlooking the creek. The air was cold enough to see their breath, but Owen lit a fire in an outdoor pit and brought thick blankets to wrap around their shoulders. They sat close together, watching flames dance and sparks spiral upward into the darkness. Nora leaned her head against Owen's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. He rested his cheek against her hair, his arm settling around her waist in a gesture that felt both natural and significant. When he finally kissed her, it was soft and unhurried, a question rather than a claim. Nora answered by deepening the connection, tasting coffee and wood smoke and something indefinable that was simply Owen. They stayed on the porch until the fire burned low, talking and kissing and existing in the space between friendship and something deeper. Neither rushed to define what was happening or demand promises about the future. They simply allowed the connection to unfold at its own pace, trusting that what was real would endure without forcing. As winter approached, Nora made the decision to stay in Meadowbrook permanently. She converted the cottage's spare room into a studio and began taking commissions, painting portraits and landscapes for local families. Her work at the community center expanded into teaching regular classes, sharing what her father had taught her about seeing the world through artists' eyes. Owen continued his carpentry, but increasingly his projects included pieces for Nora's cottage, a bookshelf for her growing collection, an easel designed specifically for her height and working style, a window seat positioned to catch morning light. Each piece was crafted with attention that went beyond professional skill. These were love letters written in wood, physical manifestations of care and consideration. One Saturday in early spring, Owen suggested they plant a garden together. The cottage had a small plot of land behind it that Beatrice had allowed to grow wild. Owen brought tools and seeds, explaining that his grandfather had taught him that carpentry and gardening shared essential principles: understanding the material, respecting natural growth patterns, and having patience for processes that could not be rushed. They worked side by side, turning soil and marking rows for vegetables and herbs. Nora's hands grew dirty, her back ached from bending, but she found deep satisfaction in the physical labor. This was creation of a different sort than painting, but no less meaningful. As they worked, Owen talked about his plans for the future, about expanding his workshop to include classes teaching traditional carpentry techniques to young people, about building furniture that could be passed through generations, creating legacy through craft. Nora shared her own hopes about developing an artist residency program in Meadowbrook, giving creative people a place to work without the pressures and distractions of city life, about proving that meaningful art could emerge from small towns and quiet lives, that ambition did not require abandoning roots. They planted tomatoes and peppers, basil and thyme, flowers whose names Nora did not know, but Owen assured her would attract butterflies and hummingbirds. With each seed pressed into earth, They were quite literally planting future, trusting that care and time would yield growth. When the work was finished, they stood together surveying the neat rows, soil, dark and ready beneath spring sunshine. Owen pulled Nora close, kissing her temple and saying that he loved her, had loved her since that first conversation beneath the elm trees at Ryan's wedding. Nora turned in his arms, meeting his eyes directly. She told him she loved him too, the steadiness of him. The way he understood that healing was not about forgetting pain, but about building something strong enough to hold both joy and sorrow without collapsing. They made love that night for the first time, in Nora's cottage, with windows open to let in the scent of fresh earth and early blooming flowers. Their connection was tender and unhurried, an extension of everything they had been building together through conversation and shared work and the slow accumulation of trust. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets, Owen's fingers tracing idle patterns on Nora's shoulder, while she listened to his heartbeat, steady and sure beneath her ear. She thought about the journey that had brought her back to Meadowbrook, about sitting in the last pew of a church and believing she was attending an ending, about how life could surprise you with beginnings disguised as closures, about finding love not through searching, but through finally being still enough to recognize it when it appeared. Owen's breathing deepened into sleep, but Nora remained awake a while longer, watching shadows move across the ceiling and thinking about gardens waiting to grow, about wood being shaped into furniture meant to last, about two people who had lost their way separately finding direction together. Outside, Meadowbrook slept beneath stars that had watched the town for generations. The creek flowed steadily past Owen's cottage, the same water that had run here when Nora was a child, that would continue flowing long after both of them were gone. But tonight, they were here, present and alive, and choosing each other with clear eyes and open hearts, building not toward some imagined perfect future, but toward the simple, profound reality of shared days and accumulated moments of grace. Nora finally drifted into sleep, Owen's warmth solid beside her, his presence a promise that tomorrow would come, and they would face it together, tending the garden they had planted, and discovering what would grow from seeds of patience, care, and love that had learned to wait for the right season.